The plasma bolt missed Lieutenant Commander Arya Voss by 3 centimeters, close enough to singe the tactical harness strapped across her chest. She cursed in 3 languages to human, one borrowed from the Kef Mori prisoners she'd interrogated last month as her assault shuttle Ragnarok's edge bucked and rolled through the debris field. That had once been the UEF Indomitable. Mayday, Mayday, this is Voss, shuttle designation Romeo 77, requesting immediate extraction. Her voice cracked slightly as another enemy fighter screamed past her viewport, its alien engines leaving trails of sickly green exhaust. My boarding party is KIA, repeat, all hands lost. Ship's AI is compromised, and I'm taking heavy fire, Static answered her. The comrade sparked and died as a near miss from a Velter plasma cannon overloaded her systems. Through the chaos, she glimpsed the massive enemy dreadnought Sorrow's Herald hanging in space like a metallic tumor, its hull bristling with weapons that had just finished turning humanity's finest battleship into expanding clouds of superheated metal and frozen atmosphere. Arya's hands moved with practiced efficiency across her controls, even as her mind raced through increasingly desperate calculations. The shuttle's engines were failing, life support showed critical damage, and her nav computer kept flashing warnings about gravitational anomalies below or what passed for below in the twisted geometry of this star system loomed Kithara Prime, the Velter homeworld that Command had been trying to crack for 8 months. She'd volunteered for this mission knowing it was likely suicide. The Indomitable had been humanity's last hope of breaking the siege, packed with enough antimatter to crack a continent. Now that hope was scattered across the void, as she was falling toward a world where humans were considered vermin fit only for experimentation or food. The shuttle's hull groaned as atmospheric entry began. She fought the controls, trying to find some angle that wouldn't turn her into a brief bright star in Kithara's purple sky. The automated systems were dying one by one. First navigation, then environmental controls, finally the inertial dampeners. Her stomach lurched as artificial gravity failed, sending her gear floating around the cramped cockpit. Through the viewport, she watched the alien landscape rush up to meet her. Crystalline spires jutted from fungal forests, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent veins that hurt to look at directly. The Velter had evolved on this nightmare world, and it showed in their architectural, organic curves and predatory angles, like the inside of some massive creature's digestive system. The shuttle hit the upper atmosphere at entirely the wrong angle. Heat shielding began to fail as friction turned the craft into a falling comet. Arya strapped herself in tighter and began the ritual that had kept her alive. Through 6 years of interstellar warfare, she got angry, not the hot, blind rage that got soldiers killed, but the cold, calculating fury that had earned her a reputation among both friends and enemies. The Velter had started this war by glassing 3 human colonies without warning. They'd broadcast the screams of dying children across hyperspace networks, calling it entertainment. They'd captured human civilians and subjected them to surgical experiments. That made ancient war crimes look quaint by comparison. Now she was behind their lines, armed with training that had been forged in the fires of a dozen desperate battles, carrying equipment that represented humanity's most advanced military technology. She was alone, outnumbered by roughly 8 billion to 1. On a planet where the very air was toxic to human physiology, the Velter had made one critical error in their assessment of human psychology. They assumed that isolation and overwhelming odds would break their enemies' spirits. They'd never encountered a species that became exponentially more dangerous when cornered. The shuttle's emergency beacon activated automatically as the craft began its final descent, broadcasting her identity and status to any human forces that might be listening. She switched it off with savage satisfaction. Where she was going, she didn't want to be rescued. She wanted to be feared. The crash site looked like a meteor had hit a cathedral. Arya's shuttle had carved a smoking furrow through what appeared to be a Velter religious complex. Its twisted spires now leaning at drunken angles, their bioluminescent organs flickering and dying. She dragged herself from the wreckage, her combat armor's medical systems already flooding her bloodstream with stimulants and painkillers. Her left arm was broken. The bone had punched through her suit's inner lining, though the armor's RGNCY sealant had prevented atmosphere loss. 3 ribs were cracked, and something was wrong with her left knee. But she was alive, armed, and increasingly furious about the situation. The first Velter patrol found her 43 minutes after impact. They came through the fungal forest like moving nightmares, their segmented bodies flowing over the terrain with disturbing grace, Each stood nearly 3 meters tall, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming with secreted acids that could dissolve human bone in seconds. Sensory tendrils writhed from their head clusters, tasting the air for chemical traces of their prey. Arya crouched behind a fallen spire, her pulse rifle charged and ready. The weapon was a masterpiece of human engineering, a directed energy weapon that could punch through tank armor at 1,000 meters. She'd named it Retribution after her first combat deployment, and it had never let her down. The lead Velter chittered something in their clicking language, probably orders to take the human alive for interrogation. Their mistake. They'd studied human combat doctrine from captured military manuals, but those manuals were written for conventional warfare between civilized species. They didn't account for what happened when you pushed humanity past the breaking point. The first alien died before it realized it was under attack. Arya's shot took its head cluster clean off, the superheated plasma cauterizing the wound even as bioluminescent fluid sprayed across the crystalline ground. The creature's body kept moving for 3 seconds, autonomic nervous system trying to process commands from a brain that no longer existed. The second Velter reacted with admirable speed, its arm spikes extending as it bounded toward her position. It cleared 6 meters in a single leap, mandibles spreading wide to reveal rows of serrated teeth. It probably expected the human to freeze in terror, or perhaps try to run. Instead, Arya rolled left and came up firing. Her second shot punched through the alien's thorax, superheating its internal fluids until they flashed to steam. The creature's exoskeleton cracked like an egg, releasing a cloud of vapor that smelled like burning sulfur and rotten meat. The third Velter was smarter. It activated some kind of personal shield, a shimmering field that deflected her next 2 shots harmlessly into the forest canopy, but shields required power, and power systems generated heat. Arya's thermal imaging revealed the device's location, a small module mounted between the creature's shoulder blades. She put her 4th shot through the shield generator. The energy field collapsed just as the alien reached her position. Arm spikes extended for a killing blow. At point-blank range, Retribution punched through chitin, bone, and whatever passed for vital organs in Velter anatomy. The creature folded around the impact point, its death shriek echoing through the twisted landscape. 3 hostiles down in less than 90 seconds. Not bad for someone with a broken arm and cracked ribs. But as she searched the bodies, Arya discovered something that made her blood run cold. Each Velter carried a communication device, organic technology, that pulsed with the same bioluminescent pattern she'd seen throughout their architecture. The devices were still active, broadcasting her location to whatever command structure controlled this sector. She had perhaps 10 minutes before reinforcements arrived. Standard doctrine would be to establish a defensive position and try to hold out until rescue arrived. But there would be no rescue. The human fleet was in full retreat, as she was alone on a world populated by creatures that viewed her species as a plague to be exterminated. Instead of running, Arya began stripping useful equipment from the dead aliens. Their weapons were biological constructs that wouldn't function for human hands, but their armor plates might be useful. More importantly, their communication devices were still linked to the local network she'd learned enough of the Velter language during her intelligence work to understand basic tactical communications. As she worked, she listened to the chatter flowing through the organic circuits. 3 more patrols were converging on her position. A full assault wing was being scrambled from the nearest military complex. They were treating her as a significant threat rather than a nuisance. Good. That meant they were already afraid. By the time she finished her preparations, the sound of approaching aircraft filled the air. Arya looked up to see a dozen Velter flyers descending through the canopy, organic constructs that looked like enormous beetles, their wings beating with mechanical precision. Each carried a full squad of soldiers. She smiled grimly and activated the devices she jury-rigged from the dead patrol's equipment. The Velter were about to learn their first lesson about human warfare. When you corner a predator, it doesn't just fight back. It evolves. The first airborne assault lasted 17 minutes and cost the Velter 43 soldiers. Arya had turned the crash site into a killing field, using the aliens' own technology against them in ways their designers had never intended. She'd wired their communication devices into an improvised early warning system, giving her precious seconds to prepare for each attack. More importantly, she discovered that their organic technology was vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse, a weakness that Retribution's plasma bolts could exploit with surgical precision. The Velter commander, a massive brute with scarred chitin, A battle-worn sensory tendril studied the tactical display with growing frustration. The human should have been dead or captured hours ago. Instead, his forces were being systematically destroyed by a single injured enemy using stolen equipment and impossible tactical knowledge. Report. He clicked to his second-in-command, a younger warrior whose bioluminescent patches flickered with nervous energy. 18 confirmed kills, Minister Vex Haller. The human has established overlapping fields of fire using our own detection. Grid. Every approach vector is compromised. She appears to be learning our communications protocols in real time. Vex Haller's mandibles ground together in thought. The human military databases they captured spoke of their enemy's adaptability, but this was beyond anything their xenobiologists had predicted. The creature was somehow interfacing with Velter technology at a level that should have been impossible for an alien nervous system. Deploy the screamers, he decided. If conventional tactics fail, we use fear. The screamers were psychological warfare weapons, living creatures bioengineered to produce sonic frequencies that induce paralysis and madness in most sentient species. They'd proven devastatingly effective against human populations during the early phases of the war, turning entire colonies into catatonic victims ready for harvesting. Arya detected the new threat through her hijacked sensor network. The approaching creatures registered as massive heat signatures moving through the underground tunnel system that honeycombed Cathara Prime's crust. Whatever the Velter were bringing to this fight, it was big, angry, and hungry. She'd been monitoring enemy communications for 3 hours now, her linguistic processing software slowly decoding their tactical language. The words psychological suppression and neural disruption kept appearing in their chatter. They were planning to break her mind before finishing the job. The first screamer emerged from a fissure in the crystalline ground 50 meters from her position. It looked like a cross between a giant centipede and a pipe organ, its segmented body studded with hollow chambers that resonated with subsonic frequencies. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was beyond description, a harmonic nightmare that seemed to reach directly into the human brain and twist everything it found there. Most humans would have dropped their weapons and begun clawing at their own faces. Arya felt the sonic assault like physical blows, her vision blurring as the sound waves interfaced with her inner ear. But she'd been trained to fight through pain, disorientation, and fear. More importantly, she'd been conditioned to get angrier when the enemy tried to break her. Retribution spoke 3 times in rapid succession. The first shot severed the creature's primary sound chamber, reducing its psychological weapon to a wet, gurgling noise. The second shot punched through its central nervous cluster. The third shot was pure vindictive pleasure, turning the thing's head into steaming biomass. But where one screamer had emerged, 3 more followed. The sound of their combined assault was devastating, a sonic barrage that made the ground itself vibrate. Arya's combat armor could filter out most frequencies, but some of the harmonics were getting through. Her hands began to shake, and dark spots appeared at the edges of her vision. She needed to move, but the sonic field made precise movement impossible. Every step sent waves of nausea through her system, and her balance was failing. The creatures were advancing slowly, savoring their victims' helplessness. That's when Arya discovered something interesting about Velter biotechnology. The creatures' sound-producing organs operated on piezoelectric principles. They generated electricity through mechanical stress, which meant they were essentially living batteries, storing massive amounts of bioelectric energy. She adjusted Retribution's targeting system, switching from thermal to electrical resonance. Instead of aiming for kill shots, she began targeting the creature's power storage organs. The results were spectacular. The first screamer exploded like a living grenade. It stored bioelectricity, discharging in a brilliant flash that temporarily overloaded every piece of Velter technology within 100 meters. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out their communication grid, blinded their sensors, and most importantly disrupted the sonic field that had been pinning her down. The second creature died in a cascade of electrical fire, its nervous system literally burning out from the inside. The third tried to retreat into the tunnel system, but Arya's fourth shot caught it in the primary resonance chamber. The explosion brought down half the crystalline spire behind her, sending fragments of alien architecture crashing through the forest canopy. As the echoes faded, an unnatural silence settled over the battlefield. Through her hijacked sensors, Arya could detect massive military formations massing at the horizon. The local commander had apparently decided that subtlety was no longer an option. She counted at least 3 full battle groups, approaching her position somewhere between 800 and 1,000 combat troops. Supported by armor and air assets, they were bringing enough firepower to level a small city. Good. She was tired of fighting patrols and scouts. It was time to show the Velter what happened when you declared war on humanity. The battle group that emerged from the fungal forest looked like something from humanity's darkest nightmares made manifest. 800 Velter warriors moved in perfect synchronization, their chitinous armor gleaming with secreted toxins. Living tank creatures the size of city buses with weapons grafted directly into their nervous systems provided mobile fire support. Above them, a swarm of aerial units darkened the purple sky, their wings beating in harmonic frequencies that made the air itself vibrate. Minister Vexhaler had committed every available resource to this engagement. The humans continued. Resistance was becoming an embarrassment. An embarrassment was not tolerated in Velter hierarchy. More concerning was the tactical intelligence. She'd somehow acquired. Her actions suggested an understanding of their military doctrine. That shouldn't have been possible for an alien mind. Arya crouched behind the wreckage of her shuttle, watching the approaching army through her improvised sensor network. She'd been monitoring their communications for hours now, and the picture that emerged was both encouraging and terrifying. The local commander was treating her as a high-priority threat, which meant massive resources were being diverted from other operations. But it also meant she was about to face firepower that could atomize everything within a square kilometer. Standard military doctrine would classify this as a hopeless situation. One human soldier, injured and running low on ammunition, against a force designed to conquer planets. The smart move would be to surrender and hope for a quick death. But Arya had stopped following standard doctrine the moment she crashed on this nightmare world. She'd been studying Velter psychology and tactical doctrine for 6 years, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. Now, surrounded and outnumbered, she'd finally found one. The Velter were excellent soldiers, but they were also high-minded, creatures who relied heavily on coordinated tactics. Their entire military structure was built around synchronized movements, shared sensory input, and collective decision-making. It made them incredibly effective against conventional forces. It also made them vulnerable to specific forms of electronic warfare. Arya activated the network of hijacked communication devices she'd been building throughout the day. Instead of using them for reconnaissance, she began broadcasting carefully crafted signals directly into the Velter command network. The aliens' organic technology was designed to interface seamlessly with their nervous systems, which meant it was also vulnerable to neurological manipulation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The lead elements of the attacking force suddenly stopped their coordinated advance as conflicting orders flooded their communication channels. Warriors began firing on their own support units, convinced they were under attack by shape-shifting enemies. The living tanks turned their weapons on nearby infantry, their artificially enhanced nervous systems unable to process the contradictory sensory input. Arya was feeding them, but the chaos wouldn't last long. Velter officers were already beginning to shut down compromised communication links, isolating their forces from the electronic warfare attack. She had perhaps 3 minutes before they restored tactical coordination. Arya used those 3 minutes to turn the battlefield into an abattoir. Retribution had been designed for precision work, single shots, clean kills, minimal collateral damage, but the weapon's power cells could be overcharged for area effect attacks, trading accuracy for devastating firepower. She'd been saving this option for a truly desperate situation. This qualified. Her first overcharged shot hit the lead tank square. In its primary weapon mount, the creature's living armor couldn't dissipate that much thermal energy fast enough, and its internal organs cooked from the inside out. The explosion sent fragments of burning chitin across the battlefield, setting the fungal undergrowth ablaze. With blue-white fire, the second shot took out a cluster of infantry that had been advancing under cover of their own smokescreen. The superheated plasma burned through the concealment, revealing the horrified faces of alien soldiers just before they ceased to exist. Their death shrieks echoed through the forest, adding to the psychological effect of the assault. By the time she'd expended half her remaining power cells, the battlefield looked like a vision of hell. Burning vegetation cast dancing shadows across scattered alien corpses, their bioluminescent organs still flickering in death. The acrid smoke of incinerated chitin mixed with the sulfurous atmosphere, creating a toxic fog that made breathing difficult, even through her combat armor's filtration system. But the Velter were adapting. the surviving officers had restored communication discipline, and their forces were beginning to coordinate again. More importantly, they had identified her position and were bringing their heaviest weapons to bear on her location. The first artillery barrage arrived 30 seconds later. Living projectiles creatures bred specifically for long-range bombardment impacted around her position with bone-rattling explosions. Each creature was packed with organic explosives that released clouds of flesh-eating bacteria, along with the kinetic damage. The combination was designed to kill anything within the blast radius twice over. Arya's position became untenable. The shuttle wreckage that had provided cover was being systematically demolished, and the biological contamination was overwhelming her armor's protective systems. She needed to move, but every direction offered only open ground and certain death. That's when she realized the Velter had made a critical tactical error in their eagerness to destroy her. They'd forgotten about the underground tunnel system that honeycombed this region. The same passages that had delivered the Screamers to the battlefield could provide an escape route, if she was willing to fight her way through whatever else might be lurking in the darkness below. As another artillery barrage reduced her last piece of cover to smoking ruin, Arya made her choice. She planted her remaining demolition charges on a timer, slung retribution across her back, and dropped through the fissure the Screamers had used to reach the surface. The tunnels were worse than she'd imagined. The walls pulsed with organic matter that might have been alive, and the air was thick with spores that made her skin crawl. But behind her, she could hear the frustrated chittering of Velter soldiers who lost their prey just as victory seemed assured. She'd bought herself time, but at a terrible cost. Down here in the darkness, she was entering the Velter world on their terms, and somewhere in these tunnels, she could hear something moving, something large and hungry that had been disturbed by all the violence above. The tunnel system beneath Kithara Prime was a living nightmare that defied human comprehension. Organic conduits pulsed with bioluminescent fluid, carrying nutrients and information through what might have been the planet's own nervous system. The walls sweated acidic compounds that made Arya's combat armor smoke and pit, while creatures that had never seen sunlight skittered through the shadows on too many legs. She'd been moving through this underground maze for 2 hours, using her hijacked sensors to avoid the worst of the indigenous life forms. But the Velter weren't far behind. Their voices echoed through the tunnel's hunting calls that spoke of patience, determination, and the absolute certainty that their prey would eventually be cornered. What they didn't know was that Arya had been studying the tunnel system's layout through their own communication network. The passages weren't random, they followed a deliberate pattern that connected to major population centers across the continent. More importantly, they led to something the Velter called the Deep Sanctum, a facility that generated massive electromagnetic signatures. If her analysis was correct, she was approaching their primary command center. The first indication that she'd found something significant came when the tunnel walls began to change. The random organic growth gave way to deliberate architecture surfaces that had been shaped rather than grown, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air itself felt different here, charged with static electricity that made her hair stand on end beneath her helmet. Then she reached the chamber. The Deep Sanctum was a cathedral of living tissue and crystalline technology, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Massive organic computers lined the walls, their surfaces crawling with data streams that resembled neural impulses. And at the center of it all, suspended in a web of biological cables, hung what could only be described as the brain of the entire planetary defense network. The Enida, for lack of a better term, was the size of a small building, its surface covered in millions of sensory organs that tracked her movement with disturbing intelligence. This was the coordination center for every Velter military operation on the planet, the nexus that allowed their high-minded culture to function across continental distances. It was also completely undefended. The Velter had never imagined that an enemy could penetrate this deep into their world. Why would they need defenses around something that existed at the heart of their civilization, surrounded by billions of their own kind? Arya smiled grimly as she began placing her remaining demolition charges around the chambers. Critical systems. The explosives were designed to disrupt electronic systems rather than cause structural damage. But in an environment where technology and biology were seamlessly integrated, the distinction became meaningless. But before she could complete the sabotage, the hunting party caught up with her. They came through the chamber's multiple entrances in perfect coordination. 60 of the Velter's finest warriors, their armor gleaming with combat stimulants and their weapons crackling with bioelectric energy. At their head walked Minister VxHFY himself, his scarred chitin telling the story of 100 battles across a dozen worlds. Human. His voice carried the clicking harmonics of barely controlled fury. You will cease this vandalism immediately. Surrender, and your death will be swift. Arya's response was to arm the demolition charges and take cover behind one of the organic computers. The device she was hiding behind was the size of a small house, its surface covered in what looked like exposed nerve endings. Perfect. Retribution had been running low on power, but the chamber's energy-rich environment provided an unexpected solution. She plugged the weapon directly into the organic computer's power grid, watching with satisfaction as her ammunition counter climbed back toward full capacity. Counteroffer, she called out, her voice echoing through the cathedral-like space. You surrender, and I'll make sure some of you survive long enough to see your homeworld burn. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of interstellar warfare. 60 elite Velter warriors, fighting on their home ground with weapons designed specifically to kill humans, against one injured human soldier armed with stolen technology and an inexhaustible supply of rage. The first phase lasted 43 seconds and cost both sides dearly. Arya's position gave her excellent fields of fire, but also limited her mobility. She used Retribution's overcharged shots to devastating effect, each blast reducing an enemy warrior to constituent atoms. But the Velter were adapting to her tactics, using the chamber's complex geometry to approach from multiple angles simultaneously. A warrior with blade modifications grafted to its limbs managed to reach her position, its weapons carving through the organic computer she'd been using. For cover, Arya rolled aside as the creature's strike carved a meter-deep gouge through living tissue, then put 3 shots center mass before it could recover. The alien's death shriek was cut short as its nervous system overloaded, but more were coming. The Velter had learned to work in coordinated pairs, one warrior providing covering fire while another advanced. Their biological weapons were well suited to the environment, drawing power from the same sources that fed the chamber's systems. That's when Arya discovered something interesting about the Deep Sanctum's construction. The organic computers weren't just processing units, they were also storage devices containing terabytes of tactical data, strategic plans, and classified information about Velter military operations across the galaxy. As the battle raged around her, she began downloading everything she could access through her hijacked interface systems. Fleet movements, defensive positions, supply lines. The entire strategic picture of the war was contained in these living databases. The Velter realized what she was doing. Just as the download completed, Minister VxHFY himself charged her position, his massive frame bristling with combat modifications that had been earned through decades of warfare. His arm spikes extended to their full length, dripping with neurotoxins that could kill a human through skin contact alone. Arya met his charge with Retribution at maximum overcharge. The shot took him in the center of his thorax, but his heavily modified anatomy absorbed the impact without slowing down. His first strike missed her head by centimeters, carving through the air with enough force to decapitate a normal human. What followed was 3 minutes of close-quarters combat that would have been impossible to survive under normal circumstances. But the chamber's energy-rich environment was affecting both combatants in unexpected ways. Arya found her reflexes enhanced by the electromagnetic fields, while VxHFY's biological weapons were drawing more power than their organic systems could safely handle. The end came when the minister overextended himself, his neurotoxin delivery system finally overloading from the constant energy drain. As he staggered, momentarily vulnerable, Arya put her last overcharged shot directly through his brain cluster. The remaining Velter warriors looked at their fallen commander, then at the human who had somehow survived impossible odds. In their culture, such a display of individual prowess was beyond comprehension. They began to retreat. Arya activated her demolition charges as the last enemy disappeared into the tunnels. The explosions wouldn't destroy the Deep Sanctum, but they would disrupt its operations for weeks. More importantly, she now possessed intelligence that could turn the tide of the entire war. Assuming she could find a way off this planet alive, the electromagnetic pulse from the Deep Sanctum's destruction rippled across Cathara Prime like a stone thrown into still water. Communication networks collapsed, defensive systems went offline, and military coordination dissolved into chaos. As the planet's primary command structure died in cascading failures, for the first time in their recorded history, The Velter were fighting blind. Arya felt the shockwave through her hijacked sensors as every piece of alien technology within 100 kilometers simply stopped working. The sudden silence was deafening. No more chittering communications, no more harmonic resonances from their organic machinery, just the sound of her own breathing inside her damaged helmet. But the destruction had come at a cost. The energy discharge had overloaded her own equipment as well. Retribution was dead, its power cells drained beyond recovery. Her combat armor systems were failing one by one, and without the Velter communication network to tap into, she was truly alone. The stolen intelligence data was still intact, stored in her armor's hardened memory banks. Everything she learned about Velter military operations, their strategic weaknesses, the locations of their primary fleet bases, information that could save humanity from extinction. But it was useless if she couldn't find a way to transmit it back to human forces. She emerged from the tunnel system into a world transformed. The bioluminescent patterns that had illuminated the alien landscape were flickering and dying, leaving vast areas in unnatural darkness. The organic spires that had reached toward the purple sky were collapsing as their support systems failed. It was beautiful in its way, like watching a cancer cure itself. But the celebration was premature. As she crested a ridge overlooking the valley where she'd first crashed, Arya saw something that made her blood freeze. A human ship, a heavy cruiser. From the look of it, hung dead in space above the planet, its hull torn open by weapons fire. Emergency pods were scattered across the landscape, their occupants either dead or captured. She wasn't the only human on Cathara Prime. The first survivor she found was barely alive, his combat armor breached in 3 places and his left leg missing. Below the knee, Lieutenant Marcus Reeves of the UEF Vindication, according to his dog tags. He looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Commander," he whispered, his voice raw from screaming. They took the others for experiments. Said they wanted to understand human pain responses before the final assault on Earth. Arya's hands clenched into fists. The Velter weren't just fighting a war, they were conducting research. Human prisoners were being dissected alive to satisfy their scientific curiosity about alien physiology. The intelligence data she'd stolen contained references to these experiments, clinical descriptions of procedures that would have made ancient torturers weep with envy. "How many?" she asked. 37 from my ship, maybe more from other crashes. They're being held in a processing facility about 10 kilometers north of here. But Commander," his voice trailed off as he looked at her damaged equipment. "It's a fortress, automated defenses, hundreds of guards. Even if we could get inside, we're not getting inside," Arya said quietly. "We're going to bring the whole thing down." Over the next 6 hours, she gathered the survivors, 18 humans in total, most of them wounded, all of them traumatized by what they'd witnessed. They had minimal weapons, no communication with the fleet, and no realistic hope of rescue. Under normal circumstances, they would have been written off as casualties of war. But these weren't normal circumstances. The stolen intelligence data contained detailed schematics of Velter military installations, including the processing facility where their comrades were being held. More importantly, it revealed a critical vulnerability in the aliens' defensive systems. The Velter relied heavily on their organic technology, which required constant maintenance from specialized support creatures. These maintenance organisms were genetically programmed to respond to specific chemical signals, pheromones, that identified friend from foe. But the programming wasn't perfect. It could be tricked, using materials scavenged from dead Velter soldiers and the wreckage of her shuttle. Arya began synthesizing a chemical cocktail that would convince the aliens' own security systems that she and her team were authorized personnel. It was insanely dangerous. One mistake in the formula would result in immediate identification and death. But it was also their only chance. The assault on the processing facility began at what passed for dawn on Cathara Prime. Arya led her team through the facility's maintenance tunnels, their movements guided by the stolen architectural data and masked by the synthesized pheromones. They encountered no resistance for the first 30 minutes, the automated systems recognizing them as authorized maintenance personnel. Then they reached the experimentation chambers. What they found there defied description. Human prisoners hung suspended in organic matrices that kept them alive, while alien surgeons carved away pieces of their anatomy for study. Some had been partially dissected, their organs replaced with Velter biotechnology in grotesque fusion experiments. Others had been subjected to psychological torture, Designed to map the neural pathways of human consciousness, all of them were still alive. The rescue operation became a mercy mission. Most of the prisoners were too damaged to move, their bodies and minds broken beyond repair. But they were still human, still capable of one final act of defiance against their captors. "Give us weapons," one prisoner whispered through lips that had been surgically modified to accommodate Vel. "Tar speech patterns. Let us die fighting." The final battle was less a coordinated assault than an explosion of human rage given form. 18 survivors and 23 rescued prisoners, armed with improvised weapons and driven by fury that transcended rational thought, tore through the processing facility like a force of nature. They had no hope of survival, no chance of escape, and no interest in surrender. They killed everything they encountered. The Velter garrison had never faced anything like it. Their opponents fought with a savagery that went beyond military training, beyond survival instinct, beyond anything in their tactical databases. Humans who should have died from their wounds kept fighting. Prisoners who could barely walk through themselves at alien guards with their bare hands. The facility's organic security systems, confused by the chemical masking and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of violence, began shutting down in self-defense. Automated barriers sealed themselves to contain the perceived contamination, trapping defenders and attackers alike in a maze of corridors that were rapidly becoming a charnel house. By the time the surviving Velter managed to call for reinforcements, it was too late. The processing facility was burning, its research data destroyed, its scientific staff dead or dying, and somewhere in the chaos, a single human had activated the facility's emergency beacon, a signal that would be detected by every ship in the system, including the human rescue fleet that had been following the wreckage trail from the Vindication. The UEF Task Force Retribution's call dropped out of hyperspace 6 hours. After the processing facility's beacon activated, Admiral Helena Cross had been tracking the debris signatures from 3 destroyed human ships, following a trail of wreckage and scattered emergency pods across half the system. What she found when her sensor swept Cathara Prime made her question the reports her intelligence officers were feeding her. "Ma'am," Commander Torres called from the tactical station, his voice tight with disbelief. "I'm reading massive electromagnetic disturbances across the planet's surface. Their entire communication grid appears to be down. Military installations are going dark across 3 continents." Admiral Cross studied the tactical display with the expression of someone who had seen too many impossible things to dismiss them out of hand. The Velter homeworld had been considered impregnable, protected by orbital defense platforms, planetary shields, and a military force that outnumbered the entire human fleet by 10 to 1. Now it looked like someone had kicked over an anthill. "Life signs?" she asked. "Difficult to determine through all the interference, but, Admiral, I'm detecting human biosignatures, multiple locations. Some appear to be in distress, but others—" Torres paused, checking his readings again. "Others are moving with purpose towards strategic targets." The first shuttle to reach the surface found Arya 3 kilometers from the burning remains of the processing facility. She was sitting on a pile of Velter corpses, methodically cleaning gore from a weapon that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and pure hatred. Her combat armor was more hull than plate, held together by emergency sealant and what appeared to be strips of alien hide. "Lieutenant Commander Voss?" The shuttle pilot's voice carried the kind of careful respect reserved for dangerous wild animals. "Admiral Cross sends her compliments and requests your immediate debriefing." Arya looked up at him with eyes that had seen things no human should have to witness. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had moved beyond the normal range of human experience. "Tell the Admiral that Cathara Prime's primary command structure has been neutralized. Their strategic database has been compromised, and I have complete intelligence on Velter fleet dispositions across 14 sectors. Also tell her that we have 41 human prisoners who require immediate medical attention, and approximately 800 enemy key are scattered across this facility." The pilot stared at her. 800? "Commander, how many people do you have down there?" 40 the total, 18 survivors from various crashes, 23 rescued prisoners, and myself. Arya's smile was the most terrifying thing the pilot had ever seen. The Velter made the mistake of trying to break us with torture and experimentation. They forgot that humans get stronger when we're angry. The debriefing lasted 18 hours and required 3 different intelligence teams to process all the information Arya had gathered. The stolen Velter databases contain operational details for their entire military machine fleet movements, supply lines, defensive positions, even the locations of their primary shipyards. It was the intelligence coup of the century, handed to them by a single soldier who had literally fought her way through the enemy's most secure facility. But the strategic implications went beyond simple military intelligence. The Welter had built their entire civilization around the concept of overwhelming superiority. They conquered through sheer numbers and technological advantage, breaking their enemies with a fight through displays of absolute power. They had never encountered a species that became more dangerous when cornered, more determined when outnumbered, more resourceful when everything seemed hopeless. Admiral Cross found Arya in the medical bay 12 hours after the debriefing concluded. The ship's doctors had done what they could for her injuries, but the real damage wasn't physical. She sat by the window, staring out at the stars with the expression of someone who had seen too much. The prisoners, Arya asked without looking away from the viewport. 21 will make full recoveries. The others? Cross shook her head. The Welter medical techniques kept them alive, but the psychological trauma may be permanent. They're being transferred to specialized facilities for long-term care. And the war changed. Cross pulled up a chair and sat down beside her subordinate. The intelligence you gathered has allowed us to identify every major Welter installation. Within 50 light years, we've already begun coordinated strikes against their supply networks. For the first time since this conflict began, we're fighting from a position of knowledge rather than ignorance. Arya finally turned away from the stars. What about Cathara Prime? Quarantine pending further study. The electromagnetic pulse you triggered when you destroyed their command center has had interesting effects on their planetary ecosystem. It appears their entire civilization was more dependent on centralized coordination than we realized. Without their communication network, local populations are reverting to some kind of primitive state. Good. The word carried more satisfaction than should have been possible in a single syllable. They wanted to study human pain responses. Now they can experience isolation and helplessness firsthand. 3 months later, the Welter Empire sued for peace. Their military machine, deprived of central coordination and facing coordinated human strikes against strategic targets, had collapsed like a house of cards. Fleet after fleet surrendered rather than face opponents who seemed to know their every move. Before they made it, the peace negotiations were held on neutral ground, mediated by the Kethmori Trade Federation. The Welter delegation arrived expecting to discuss terms of surrender. They had prepared detailed proposals for reparations, territorial concessions, and military restrictions. Instead, they found themselves facing Lieutenant Commander Arya Voss across the negotiation table. She had been promoted twice since Cathara Prime, not for her tactical innovations or strategic insights, but for what the human military had classified as extreme competence under impossible circumstances. The Welter delegates recognized her immediately from their intelligence files. The human who had single-handedly crippled their homeworld and stolen their most classified military secrets. We have reviewed your terms. The lead delegate clicked in carefully modulated human speech. The territorial concessions are acceptable. The reparations, while extensive, can be managed. But there is one condition we cannot agree to. Arya leaned back in her chair with the patient expression of a predator that knew its prey was already trapped. Which one? The clause requiring us to provide detailed information about our experimental programs. Our scientific methodology is proprietary. Surely you understand the need to protect intellectual property. The silence that followed lasted exactly 37 seconds. When Arya finally spoke, her voice carried the same flat, emotionless tone that had become her trademark since Cathara Prime. Let me clarify something for your delegation. This isn't a negotiation. This is me explaining the terms of your surrender. You will provide complete documentation of every experiment you conducted on human prisoners. You will identify every facility where such research took place. You will turn over every piece of data you gathered through torture and vivisection. She leaned forward slightly. Or I will personally visit every world in your empire and demonstrate what humans are capable of. When we stop being civilized, the Welter delegate's sensory tendrils writhed in what might have been fear. You cannot threaten an entire species with, "Watch me." Arya's smile was the same expression that had terrified a shuttle pilot 3 months earlier. I've already proven that your homeworld's defenses mean nothing to a sufficiently motivated human. How many worlds do you think I could cripple before your military manages to stop me? How many of your civilians would die while you tried to coordinate a response? Through the communication networks I've already compromised, the peace treaty was signed 6 hours later. 5 years after the war ended, Lieutenant Commander Arya Voss retired from active service and disappeared into civilian life. The official records listed her as psychologically unsuitable for continued military operations. But those who had served with her knew the truth. She hadn't been broken by her experiences on Cathara Prime. She had been perfected by them. The Velter Empire never again attempted territorial expansion beyond their core systems. Their military doctrine was completely rewritten, emphasizing defensive strategies and diplomatic solutions over aggressive conquest. They had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. And sometimes, late at night in the depths of space, Velter mothers would tell their young ones cautionary tales about the human who had fallen from the stars. The stories varied in detail, but they all ended the same way. She fell behind enemy lines, alone and outnumbered, but she did not break. She did not surrender. Instead, she became something that haunted their dreams for generations to come. Proof that some prey, when cornered, transforms into the most dangerous predator of all. In the end, the Velter learned what humanity had always known: the most dangerous weapon in the universe isn't technology or superior numbers. It's the refusal to give up, no matter the odds.